Students, today we will study sexual reproduction in the plants. In the plants, steps of sexual reproduction occur in a specific reproductive organ that is known as the flower. So that structure is the flower, you all know. The plants which have flowers, they are known as the flowering plant, while which do not have the flower, they are known as the non-flowering plant. Flowering plants are also known as the angiosperm, and non-flowering plants are known as the gymnosperm. These flowers, they produces egg and sperms. Then fertilization also takes place inside the flowers. So it means flower is the main reproductive structure in the plants, right students? Now we will study the structure of a typical flower, कि फ्लावर का स्ट्रक्चर किस तरह से होता है, फ्लावर के कौन कौन से पार्ट्स होते हैं, एंड व्हाट आर द डिफरेंट फंक्शंस ऑफ दीज पार्ट्स. सो वी विल स्टार्ट इट with the base of the flower. Now you can see the start of the flower, it is from this structure. This is known as the peduncle. This peduncle is the stalk of the flower. At the top of this stalk, a special structure is there, that is receptacle. On this receptacle, all the four whorls of the flower are attached. Means a typical flower have four whorls, four cycles, and these four cycles, they are attached at this structure which is known as the receptacle. Now one by one we will study the different parts of a flower. Now from this diagram, if you will see, then the first part you can see, it is the sepal. You can see the sepal, it is green in color, and its function is to protect the flower during its bud stage. Means when flower is in its bud stage, at that time it protects the flower. Then the second whorl of flower is known as the petals. The colored part you can easily see in most of the flowers, and this colored part is known as the petals. These petals attract the insects for the process of the pollination. Then coming to the next part of the flower, that is the male reproductive part of the flower, which is known as the stamen. This stamen, it consists of two parts. First part is the anther and the other part is the filament, right students? Now this filament, it is a long stalk that bears an anther at the top. Next whorl of the flower is known as the female reproductive organ, which is known as the pistil. It is also known as the carpel. It is having three parts: stigma, style, and the ovary. These are the three parts. Now the function of these parts, what is the function? So the stigma, it receives the pollen grains during the pollination and support their growth. Then this style, this is hollow style, it bears stigma in a suitable position to receive the pollen, and also it provides the passage for the entry of the pollen tube. This we will see further. Then the ovary, it is the swollen part and hollow basal part which contain ovules. So inside this ovary, the ovules are present. Now types of the flowers. What are the different types of the flowers? So flowers are of two types. The first type is the unisexual flower, and the second type is the bisexual flower. Unisexual flowers, the flowers which contain either stamen or the pistil, means either male reproductive part or either female reproductive part. Example, papaya and watermelon. Bisexual flower, the flower which contain both, means stamen and pistil. Example, hibiscus and the mustard. Now these are the male and female reproductive parts. Separately the structures are given. The first is the stamen. Two parts are there. The first part is the anther and the second is the filament. Anther is the part of the stamen that produce pollens, and filament, it is the stalk like structure that hold the anther. And pollen grains, these are the male gametophyte which consist of male gametes. Means inside the pollen grain, the male gametes are present. So this is the structure of the stamen, that is male reproductive part. Now coming to the another part, that is the female reproductive part. Female reproductive part is also known as the carpel or pistil. It contains ovary. You can see this part is the ovary. It is an enlarged structure at the base of the carpel or pistil where the ovules are present. It becomes the fruit after the fertilization. Very important that ovary converts into the fruit. This question was asked this year also in the board exam. Then the second, ovules. They contain female germ cell or the egg cell and it becomes seed after the fertilization. Next part is the stigma. This is the stigma where the pollen grains stick. The stigma is sticky, so the pollen grain they stick on it. And the next is the style. This is the style, which is a hollow tube which connect stigma to the ovary. So these are the male and female reproductive parts of the flower. Now coming to the steps in the sexual reproduction. So these are main 4 steps: pollination, germination of the pollen grain, then fertilization, and then formation of the fruit and the seed. One by one we will study about them. First is the pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the male anther to the female stigma. So the pollen grains, they get transferred from the male anther to the female stigma. What is the need of pollination? So the need of pollination is that male gametes which is present in the pollen grain, means here the male gamete is present in the pollen grain, it need to fuse with the female gamete which is present here to form the zygote. For this process, this pollen needs to transfer from the stamen to the stigma. So for that this pollen need to transfer, so that is why the pollination is required. Types of the pollination you all know, it is of 2 types, self pollination and the cross pollination. What is self pollination? So transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. सेम फ्लावर है, उसी में अगर ट्रांसफ़र हो रहा है तो दैट इज़ नोन एज द सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन. क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन, ट्रांसफ़र ऑफ पोलन ग्रेन फ्रॉम एंथर टू द स्टिग्मा ऑफ अनदर फ्लावर, तो दैट इज़ नोन एज द क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन. नाउ after pollen lands on the suitable stigma, it has to reach to female gamete present in the ovary. For this, pollen grain germinate on the stigma and form a pollen tube. This pollen tube travels through the style and reaches the ovule present in the ovary. How? See this diagram. In this diagram, you can clearly see that at this point, the pollen grains, by the process of pollination, they stick here. Now, what happens, students? These pollen grains stick over the stigma of the carpel. Now, these pollen grains, they absorb water, swell and germinate to produce a pollen tube. Now, you can see this is a pollen tube which is germinated and formed by the pollen grains. This pollen tube passes through the style. This is the style. So, from this style, the pollen tube passes and moves towards the ovary and it reaches to the ovary. Right, students? Now, 2 non-motile gametes are formed inside the tube. Inside this pollen tube, 2 non-motile gametes are formed, and these gametes also passes or travels through the style. Now, after reaching to the ovary, pollen tube, when it reaches to the ovary, this pollen tube, it enters the ovule through the micropyle. This is the place which is the micropyle. So, from this micropyle, this pollen tube, it reaches into the ovary. After moving in, the tip of the pollen tube ruptures. As soon as it moves inside, what happens? The tip of the pollen tube ruptures and the 2 male gametes, they are released into the embryo sac. Now, this is the part, this whole part, it is the embryo sac. This embryo sac, this part is the embryo sac. This embryo sac is also known as the female gametophyte. Now, we have to understand the spatial structure of the embryo sac of the female gametophyte. This embryo sac is like this. In this embryo sac here, 2 cells and 1 egg is present. These 2 cells, they are known as the synergids. They are known as the synergids, and this egg is there. In between this, again two polar nuclei are present, and at this corner again they have the 3 cells and which are known as the antipodal. So again here these 2 cells are there, these 2 cells are synergids, plus they have one egg here. Now at the center they have 2 nuclei which are known as the polar nuclei, and at the top again they have the 3 cells which are known as the antipodal cell. This is the whole setup of this embryo sac. Now students, what happens during fertilization? During fertilization, now we know that through the pollen tube 2 male gametes enter. So one male gamete, it fuses with the egg here. We know that egg is present along with 2 synergid. Right now I explained you. So the egg, it fuses with the first male gamete, and due to this a diploid structure, that is zygote, is formed. This fusion of male and female gamete is known as the fertilization. It occurs inside the ovule. So due to this fertilization, zygote is formed, and due to further mitotic divisions it will converts into the embryo. Now another male gametes, 2 gametes were there na? So another male gametes, it fuses with the polar nuclei. Polar nuclei, they were present here at the center. So the another male gamete, it fuses with these 2 polar nuclei and it form a triploid structure, that is known as the endosperm. So this mechanism, it involves 2 acts of fertilization. You can see one time the pollen grain or male gamete, it fuses with the egg cell, and second time it fuses with the 2 polar nuclei. So 2 times the fertilization is taking place. That is why this process is known as the double fertilization, and in this process a triploid structure is formed. So that is why it is known as the triple fusion, and this is the specific structure or characteristic feature of the angiosperm plants. Now after fertilization, what happens? Now this fertilization is over. So this is the double fertilization. I have explained you what happens. Now after the fertilization, the zygote divides several times. It forms the embryo, and the ovule, it develops into the seed, and ovary develops into the fruit, and the sepal, petal, stigma, style, they all fall down. ये सब गिर जाते हैं, सिर्फ कौन सा पार्ट बचता है? ओव्यूल and the ovary. Now structure of the seed. So we know that the seed, it has cotyledons. On the basis of cotyledon we can divide it into monocotyledon and dicotyledon. So seed structure is, it's have cotyledon, it's have another structure that is known as the plumule. Plumule gives the stem or the shoot system, and radicle which gives the root system. Now coming to the structure of the seedling. When the seed develops, what type of the structure? So it is having a special structure, that is micropyle. This micropyle, it is the opening. This is the micropyle. This is the opening in the ovule where pollen tube attached and sperm enters. So this is the entry point. Then hilum, it is a scar where ovule is attached to the ovary. This is the hilum, and the radicle, it is the embryonic root, means from this part the root develops. Then coming to the next part, that is the epicotyle. It grows above the cotyledon and give rise to the leaves. Epicotyle above the part and it gives leaves, and hypocotyle, it is the part which is the below the point of attachment of the cotyledon, and it develops into the stem. So when seed are formed, they develop. So these seed contain the future plant or embryo which developed into the seedlings under different conditions, and this process is known as the seed germination. So that is how the complete whole process of sexual reproduction in the plants takes place. Thank you, students.